The sun was sinking low over the dusty plains, painting the horizon in a fiery orange that swallowed the edges of the land. The wind carried whispers of long-forgotten trails and the faint smell of smoke from distant campfires. Among the scattered tumbleweeds and jagged rocks, a lone figure rode steadily, his horse's hooves clattering against the hard earth. The man's face was weathered, etched by years under the merciless sun, and his eyes carried the kind of quiet determination that spoke of someone who had seen more than his share of hardship. He was an Apache warrior, not tall but lean and strong, moving with the confidence of a man who knew his own path. He had come into town that day with little more than a pack slung across his shoulder and a single coin clinking in his hand. $9.50, the exact amount he had in his possession, saved over months through careful work and traded favors. But the coin would not be spent on gold, silver, or supplies. The town's market square was full of curious eyes, wary townsfolk, and the occasional stranger seeking their own fortune, yet all attention would turn to the man and what he intended to do with that small sum. The woman he sought was known throughout the region, though not for reasons that drew admiration. She had lived a life marked by whispers, the kind that people share in quiet corners or behind closed doors. She could not have children, and in the old ways of the land, that made her less than others in the eyes of those who clung to old superstitions and traditions. Some said she was cursed, others said she simply carried misfortune with her, and yet she carried herself with a dignity few could match. Her eyes were sharp and aware, not blind to the judgments around her, and her movements were careful, measured, as though she always expected the world to strike first. The Apache rode slowly through the town, and the chatter dimmed wherever he passed. Merchants paused mid-sentence, children ducked behind carts, and men with knives and prideful hearts straightened in their seats. There was something in the way he moved that demanded notice, not with arrogance, but with certainty. He dismounted with the calm patience of someone who had made a decision that no one else could question. The woman noticed him first, her expression tightening, not with fear, but curiosity. Many had come before, offering words, promises, or money, yet none had approached with the quiet conviction she saw in him. When the exchange happened, it was simple, almost anticlimactic. $9.50 passed from hand to hand, and murmurs swirled around them. People leaned from doorways and market stalls, unable to resist the spectacle. But no one saw the glance that passed between the two, a glance that carried more weight than any coin could measure. Something unspoken shifted in that moment. It was neither charity nor a bargain. It was the beginning of a decision that would ripple through their lives in ways no one could predict. The Apache did not speak much, yet when he finally did, his words were deliberate, measured, and carried a strange kind of authority. He told her of the land beyond the hills, of the open trails where no law but the earth's own rules held sway. He spoke of freedom, of opportunity, of a life shaped by courage rather than circumstance. It was not a threat nor a plea, but a statement simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. The woman's lips pressed together, and for a long moment she said nothing. The market held its collective breath, sensing that the ordinary rhythm of their lives had fractured and something larger was unfolding. As the sun slipped behind the mountains, the shadows grew long and the town seemed to shrink under the weight of what was happening. The Apache and the woman left the square without fanfare, their figures swallowed by the dimming light. But the tension lingered, like smoke rising from a smoldering fire, reaching into every corner of the streets. People whispered among themselves, speculating on his intentions. Why would a man, known for his independence and strength, invest his small fortune in someone deemed unlucky or incomplete by society's harsh standards? No one could guess, and even if they tried, the answer would defy the simple expectations of the day. The journey that began that evening would carry them into unknown lands, across plains where danger was constant and survival demanded cunning. The Apache, steady and unyielding, had a plan that no one in that sleepy town could understand. It was not vengeance, nor was it desire. It was something sharper, more daring, and impossible to measure with money or gossip. And the woman, whose life had long been defined by what she could not give, would soon discover a strength buried within herself, awakened by the man who had seen her for more than what others said she was. Night fell with a chill, and the first stars pricked the sky like tiny points of watchful light. Around the campfire, where the horse hobbled nearby and the wind whispered secrets through the grass, the Apache prepared for the first night on the trail. He arranged supplies with care, inspected his weapon, and scanned the horizon with eyes that never rested. The woman sat quietly, unsure of what the future would demand, yet feeling a strange sense of security in his presence. There was no talk of promises or pity, only a shared understanding that the road ahead was theirs to navigate, and that every choice from this moment on would shape them irrevocably. By morning, the world outside the small clearing would have no knowledge of the decision made under the stars. Traders would open shops, children would chase stray animals, and gossip would resume. Yet the course of history for these two would already have been set. The Apache's move, simple in its appearance but profound in its implications, had set into motion a chain of events that no one in the town or perhaps in the entire territory could have anticipated. And the woman, caught between fear and curiosity, began to understand that the path she was stepping onto would demand courage unlike anything she had known. What no one could see, not even those watching from afar, was the ripple of consequences waiting just beyond the horizon. There were forces and eyes in the land that moved silently, watching, waiting for opportunity. The Apache's decision was bold, almost reckless, but it carried with it a sharp edge of strategy only he understood. Every step forward would test their resilience, their trust, and the measure of their character in ways the ordinary town could never imagine. The coin spent was a symbol, not a cost. And in the quiet of that first night, around a flickering fire and the smell of earth and wood smoke, the story truly began. There was a moment, brief and almost imperceptible, when the woman looked at him and asked the question that no one else dared to voice. The Apache's gaze met hers, unwavering, and the answer hung in the air, heavy with unspoken intent. What would follow could change everything for her, for him, and for the scattered lives tied to the land in ways invisible to the eye. The wind carried a warning through the trees, a sound that might have been nothing more than a trick of nature, but felt to them both like a herald of what was to come. And then, as the fire flickered low, shadows dancing across their faces, a noise came from beyond the ridge. Something was moving, deliberate and unseen, and it made the horse tense, ears twitching toward the dark. The Apache's hand went instinctively to the weapon at his side, eyes narrowing, muscles coiled for action. The woman, stiff with tension, felt the hairs on her arms rise, sensing the first stirrings of danger that would define their journey. They did not yet know what waited, but they could feel it, a presence, silent and patient, watching, waiting to test the courage of those who had dared to step beyond the ordinary. The night deepened, carrying them toward a horizon neither could yet see. And in that darkness, the first sparks of the story ignited, hinting at challenges, choices, and revelations that would shape lives, test hearts, and defy expectations. The Apache had made his move, bold and improbable, and the world held its breath. What would happen next was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the path they had chosen would not allow them to turn back. A sudden rustle in the nearby brush made both of them freeze, the firelight throwing long shadows across tense faces. The horse stamped once, then whinnied softly, ears pinned forward. The wind shifted, carrying a faint but unmistakable scent smoke and something else, sharp and metallic. The Apache's eyes scanned the darkness, the instincts honed over years under the sun guiding every motion. The woman gripped the edge of the blanket she had wrapped around herself, feeling the weight of every step that had brought her here, knowing that the life she thought she understood was already gone. And then the night held its breath, waiting as they stared into the unknown, neither speaking, each aware that the next moment could change everything. The rustle grew louder, breaking the quiet of the night like a knife through cloth. The Apache's hand tightened around the worn grip of his revolver, every sense alert, trained over years of navigating danger on the plains. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, catching glimpses of movement between the rocks and sagebrush. The woman shifted closer, instinctively seeking the protection he offered, though she did not lower her own head. Her sharp gaze mirrored his, and in that shared tension, a fragile bond began to form. The night seemed to stretch. Each sound amplified: the crack of a dry branch, the whisper of the wind through the leaves, the soft padding of feet on soil. The Apache did not speak, letting the silence speak for him, a signal to stay still, to observe, to wait. He had faced predators, men and beasts alike, in the long trails of the West, and he knew that haste often invited disaster. The woman watched him, her curiosity mingled with caution, realizing that the man who had paid so little for her freedom understood things about the land and its dangers that she could not yet grasp. Hours passed, though it was impossible to tell under the canopy of darkness. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the rustling ceased, replaced by a subtle pressure in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. The Apache finally exhaled slowly, relaxing his grip just enough to show he had not mistaken the signs, but also that the threat was not fully revealed. He did not explain, but the look in his eyes told the woman everything she needed to know. Survival depended on awareness, patience, and trust in those who had earned it. She thought back to the moment in town, to the $9.50 exchanged, to the quiet glance that had passed between them. She understood now that the price had never been the measure of value. The coin was a key, unlocking a chance at something different, something beyond the judgments and limitations that had defined her existence. And yet, she could not help but feel the weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. The plains were wide and empty, but the silence was deceptive. Danger could hide anywhere. As the first faint light of dawn brushed the horizon, the landscape revealed itself in soft, muted tones. The hills rolled gently, dotted with hardy brush and jagged stones, and the river glinted faintly in the distance, winding like a silver ribbon through the land. The Apache rose, stretching lean muscles honed from years of travel and survival. He moved with the ease of a man who had lived many lives under the unforgiving sun, whose instincts were as sharp as the knife at his belt. The woman watched, noticing the way his eyes swept the land, noting every shadow, every break in the terrain. He offered her a hand, helping her to her feet. She accepted, feeling a strange reassurance in his calm authority. They did not speak much as they packed the fire, loaded the horse, and set off along a narrow trail that disappeared into the hills. The journey was slow, deliberate, each step measured, each pause purposeful. They passed through valleys where the wind carried the faint scent of distant pine, and over ridges where the earth dropped sharply, revealing endless plains below. The woman began to notice the Apache's way of reading the land, sensing hidden water sources, safe resting spots, and potential hazards. It was as if he had a map imprinted in his mind, one drawn not on paper but in experience and instinct. She tried to learn, to follow his cues, but she also discovered how little she had understood about the world beyond the small town she had called home. She had spent her life judged for what she could not do, and yet here, in the wide openness of the plains, she felt a stirring of possibilities she had never known. And still, the uncertainty lingered. The movement they had sensed the night before could return. The world was not kind, and the Apache had warned her in ways he never needed to speak aloud. By midday, they reached a small clearing near the river, where tall grasses swayed in the heat of the sun. The Apache dismounted first, scanning the perimeter, eyes sharp for any sign of trouble. The woman followed, keeping close, noticing how he observed not only the land but also the behavior of the animals. Birds took flight suddenly, and a rabbit darted across the open ground. He watched quietly, noting patterns that would alert them to danger long before it arrived. The woman began to understand that survival here demanded more than strength or speed. It demanded awareness, patience, and respect for the land. They paused to rest, and the Apache finally spoke, his voice low but steady. He asked her about her life in the town, about the days she had spent confined by whispers and suspicion. She spoke hesitantly at first, then more openly as she realized he was not judging, only listening. He nodded occasionally, his expression unreadable, but she sensed approval in the way he focused on her words, as if the stories of her past were pieces of a larger puzzle he was trying to understand. As the sun climbed higher, the sense of unease returned. Something in the hills had shifted, subtle but undeniable. The Apache sensed it before he could see it, muscles tensing, eyes scanning every ridge and hollow. The woman followed his gaze and saw it too, a shadow moving against the slope, almost too deliberate to be an animal. She froze, heart pounding, and the Apache's hand went instinctively to his revolver. The shadow paused, then melted back into the rocks, leaving a lingering tension in its wake. "Someone is watching," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. The woman nodded, gripping the strap of her pack, realizing that her journey into freedom came with risks she had never faced before. The land was beautiful, vast, and untamed, but it was also unforgiving, and she had only just begun to understand the dangers hidden in its folds. They moved on, careful to stay low and follow the natural cover the terrain provided. Every step was deliberate, each pause a measure of caution. The woman noticed the Apache's way of signaling without words, a slight tilt of his head, a subtle motion of his hand, a shift in stance. She began to follow, learning quickly that trust and attention were their best defenses. Yet with every hill they crossed, every bend in the river, the sense of being watched grew stronger. She could feel it like a pulse, a pressure that pressed against the edge of her awareness. The hours stretched, and the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the land. They reached a narrow canyon, its walls steep and rugged, and the trail narrowed to a winding path along a rocky ledge. The Apache moved first, testing each foothold, listening to the rock for signs of weakness. The woman followed, careful not to disturb the loose stones underfoot. Somewhere above, a hawk circled silently, and the cry of the bird seemed to echo the tension that had built within them. Suddenly, a sharp sound rang out, a rock shifting underfoot, falling into the canyon below with a distant crash. The horse shied, and the woman stumbled, catching herself against the Apache's shoulder. He held her steady, eyes scanning the cliff edges and ridges. The presence they had sensed all day was no longer just a feeling. Something or someone was moving in the shadows, tracking their every step. The Apache did not speak, only shifted to position himself between the woman and the potential threat. The canyon walls pressed close, narrowing their path, and the sense of danger tightened around them. The woman felt a mix of fear and exhilaration, the kind that comes when one realizes the world is larger, wilder, and far more unpredictable than ever imagined. She had spent her life measured against what she could not do, what she lacked, but here, walking beside the Apache, she felt the stirrings of strength she had never known. She could survive, she could endure. And yet, the unknown waited, patient and silent, beyond each turn in the trail. The Apache paused at a small ledge overlooking a bend in the canyon. He knelt, examining the ground, noting footprints barely visible in the dust and sand. He looked up at her, expression unreadable but eyes sharp. "They're close," he said simply. "But we know the land. We have time to choose the path." The woman nodded, understanding without question. It was not just the creatures or men that lurked beyond. They were navigating a world shaped by caution, instinct, and the thin line between survival and disaster. As they descended carefully along the ledge, The shadows lengthened, and the canyon seemed to grow tighter, echoing every footstep. The wind shifted, carrying a scent unfamiliar but unmistakably human. The Apache froze, listening, muscles coiled like a spring. The woman could feel the tension radiating from him, and she realized that their journey was no longer just about escape or freedom. It was about facing forces that were patient, relentless, and unseen. By the time they reached the base of the canyon, the sun had almost disappeared, leaving the world in dim twilight. The trail opened into a small, sheltered glade where a creek wound through the rocks. The Apache moved quickly to secure the perimeter, scanning the surrounding brush, while the woman gathered water and prepared a modest fire. The night pressed close, and with it, the presence that had shadowed them all day remained, waiting for a moment of weakness. Sitting by the fire, the woman spoke softly, testing the calm she had begun to feel. She asked why he had paid $9.50, why he had chosen her when the world had turned away. The Apache's gaze remained on the fire, the flickering flames reflecting in his eyes. "It was never about the coin," he said finally. "It's about what you carry inside. The land, the trail, the unknown, that is where value is measured." She nodded, absorbing his words, though the full meaning eluded her. She could sense that the explanation was deeper than anything spoken aloud, rooted in experiences she could not yet understand. Above, the first stars appeared, pale points of light in the darkening sky. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night, each one a tiny, fleeting flame against the vast darkness. The Apache and the woman remained alert, aware that the danger had not vanished, only shifted. They were on a path that would demand courage, resilience, and the kind of trust that grows slowly in the shadow of shared trials. The land around them was alive with unseen eyes, silent watchers that would test their resolve at every turn. And as the night deepened, a distant sound reached them, a faint, rhythmic echo, deliberate and measured, coming from somewhere far beyond the creek. The Apache's head tilted, listening, muscles tensing. The woman felt her pulse quicken, understanding that the story of their journey had only just begun. What they faced next could change everything, and the choices they would make in the hours to come would define the rest of their lives. The firelight flickered across tense faces, highlighting determination, curiosity, and the unspoken bond forming between them. Outside the circle of light, the shadows waited, patient, silent, and full of intent. The Apache had made his move, and the woman had followed, stepping into a world that promised freedom, danger, and discovery. Yet the horizon held mysteries neither of them could predict, and the night whispered that the path ahead would demand more than courage alone. The glade fell into silence, broken only by the gentle babble of the creek and the distant rustle of leaves. The woman stared into the darkness, sensing the unseen eyes, and wondered what forces moved just out of reach, shaping their fate. The Apache remained vigilant, every sense attuned, ready to act if the unknown chose to reveal itself. The night stretched endlessly, and the story of the coin, the choice, and the journey was far from finished. In the quiet, the woman realized that her life had changed forever in a single, impossible act. The $9.50 had bought more than freedom. It had bought a chance to step into a world she had never dared to imagine. And yet, the shadows pressed close, reminders that the journey would be anything but easy. Every step forward carried uncertainty, and every glance into the darkness hinted at challenges that would test the limits of courage, wit, and endurance. The night held them in its embrace, vast and patient, waiting to see what the dawn would bring and what the first move of the Apache and of the woman he had chosen would reveal. The first light of dawn seeped into the glade, pale and hesitant, as if the land itself was reluctant to reveal what lay beyond the shadows. The Apache had been awake for hours, moving silently, checking the perimeter, listening to the subtle sounds of life in the wild. The woman stirred, eyes heavy but alert, realizing that rest was not a luxury they could afford. The air carried a chill, and even the creek's soft murmur seemed to hum with tension. Something watched, always, somewhere beyond the trees and rocks. They broke camp quickly, the Apache moving with practiced efficiency. Every action was purposeful, every glance calculated. The woman tried to match him, but her movements were slower, weighed down by uncertainty and the lingering fear of the unknown. She noticed how he observed the terrain, the bends of the creek, the rise of the hills, the gaps in the forest where light barely touched the ground. He noted tracks in the soft mud, a subtle print of a man or animal that had passed hours before, and a broken branch that might have been brushed against deliberately. To him, nothing was random. To her, it was a revelation of a world she had never truly understood. As they moved along a narrow ridge, the main conflict of their journey began to take shape. Beyond the immediate threat of unseen watchers, there was something larger pressing against the land, something older and more relentless than any single man. Stories had reached the town of strange figures moving through the plains, preying on travelers, leaving only whispers and fear behind. The Apache knew them by reputation, not by sight, and that knowledge sharpened the edge of every decision. The woman asked him questions, tentative but urgent, and he answered sparingly, revealing fragments of the larger danger they faced. "They move in groups," he said quietly, scanning the slopes. "Silent, quick, and they strike when least expected. We've seen traces, but never their numbers. Their eyes are everywhere." He paused, studying a ridge where the shadows clung like smoke. "We cannot outrun them forever. We must use the land, and we must use our minds." The woman felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. This was more than a chase or a threat. It was a test, a slow pressure on the edges of survival, and she realized that every instinct she had relied on in the town would not be enough here. As they crested the ridge, a small herd of deer bounded across the plain below, startled by some hidden presence. The Apache noted the movement, crouching low, signaling for her to do the same. He had a way of moving that made him part of the earth, blending with the shadows, eyes always scanning, listening, calculating. She tried to mimic him, but every movement reminded her of the distance between what she knew and what was necessary to survive. And yet, in those long stretches of silence, she began to learn, observing, absorbing, understanding that courage was forged in moments like this. The main conflict began to split into layers as they descended into a narrow valley. The unseen watchers were no longer distant, and the traces of their passage were undeniable footprints, broken foliage, and subtle sounds carried by the wind. But there was also another tension building, one that had nothing to do with enemies. The woman wrestled with her own doubts, her own fears of inadequacy, of worth defined by the limitations the town had imposed. The Apache sensed it, the pause in her step, the hesitation at the sound of a distant branch snapping, and he did not scold. He allowed her the space to confront her own uncertainty, knowing that this internal struggle was as dangerous as any predator outside the canyon. They found a small alcove beside a rocky outcrop and paused for a brief moment. The woman crouched low, studying the land, while the Apache used a pair of worn binoculars to scan the surrounding slopes. From this height, they could see the path ahead, winding along the river, and the ridges where danger might emerge. The air was tense, filled with the subtle vibrations of creatures moving, watching, waiting. The woman realized that this journey demanded more than strength or speed. It required attention, intelligence, and trust in someone who had mastered these skills over a lifetime. A sudden sound different from the earlier rustling made her jump. The Apache's hand went to his revolver, eyes narrowing. It was a whistle, low and deliberate, carried by the wind. He gestured for her to stay low, moving toward a small thicket where he could hide while keeping sight of the trail. From this vantage, he could see figures moving with purpose in the distance, several men, or perhaps hunters of a different kind, their movements precise, almost rehearsed. He muttered under his breath, words she could not understand, then signaled her forward, careful, deliberate, silent. As they moved, another layer of the conflict unfolded. The woman noticed subtle signs of life beyond the human threat scavengers, predators and evidence of older trails left by those who had crossed these lands before. The Apache explained, briefly and quietly, that understanding the rhythms of the land was essential to survival. They were not just running from enemies. They were navigating a system of threats that included the land itself, as unforgiving as any man or animal. She began to see the logic in his actions, the careful measurement of each step, the use of shadows and cover, the assessment of terrain and opportunity. The subplots of the journey began to intertwine. The woman's growing confidence, the lessons of the land, and the constant threat of unseen watchers layered over the immediate danger of pursuit. Each step forward was a negotiation with fear, trust, and instinct. At one point, they encountered a shallow stream, and the Apache paused, testing the banks for hidden traps, studying the water for signs of passage. He instructed her on how to move quietly, to minimize noise, and to watch for subtle signs: broken twigs, disturbed soil, faint echoes in the wind. Every movement became a test, every glance a measure of awareness. As midday approached, the tension escalated. A group of mounted men appeared on a distant ridge, silhouetted against the sun. The Apache signaled for her to crouch, then whispered a plan in quiet, urgent tones. They would use the river as cover, move silently along its banks, and rely on shadows to conceal their passage. The woman felt her pulse quicken, aware that a single misstep could mean capture or worse. Yet she moved, mimicking his actions, trusting in his judgment, and beginning to trust in her own instincts as well. The watchers on the ridge remained just out of reach, their presence a constant pressure. The Apache's eyes never wavered, scanning, calculating, anticipating. He had faced threats like this before, relying on knowledge, patience, and timing rather than sheer force. The woman followed, absorbing every lesson, feeling the growing strength of her own courage. And still, the tension remained unbroken. The watchers had not revealed themselves fully, and the land itself seemed to hold secrets, testing their resolve. As they moved through the riverbed, the woman glimpsed signs of others who had been there before: discarded items, footprints, and traces of campfires long extinguished. The Apache pointed them out, explaining the subtle differences between signs left by travelers, hunters who meant harm. Each clue added to the complexity of their path, and the woman began to understand that survival was not simple. It demanded observation, reasoning, and the ability to anticipate threats that were both human and natural. By late afternoon, the main ridge they had aimed for came into view, a line of rocks rising sharply against the horizon. The Apache paused, studying the path ahead, then glanced at her. "We must move carefully from here," he said. "They are closer than you think." His voice was calm, but the urgency behind it was unmistakable. The woman nodded, heart pounding, realizing that the true test of the day was not just in reaching safety, but in navigating the tension, the fear, and the uncertainty that had built along the trail. They advanced cautiously, every step measured, every pause deliberate. The shadows lengthened, carrying the promise of evening, and with it, the risk that unseen threats could strike under the cover of darkness. The woman felt the weight of the unknown pressing in, yet also the stirrings of empowerment. She was learning, growing, and beginning to see herself not as someone defined by what she could not do, but by how she responded when every instinct, every skill, and every ounce of courage was tested. As they reached a narrow pass, a sudden movement caught their attention. Figures emerged from the rocks ahead, men mounted and armed, eyes sharp and focused. The Apache froze, signaling her to take cover behind a boulder. They observed, calculating, waiting for the right moment to move. The presence they had sensed all day was no longer a distant pressure. It was immediate, deliberate, and poised to test their resolve. The woman gripped the rock, knuckles white, but a part of her recognized the thrill, the clarity, the need to rely on instincts she had never trusted before. The Apache whispered instructions, subtle but precise, guiding her movements as they edged along the pass. Each decision, each step, was a negotiation with danger, a measure of awareness and patience. The watchers remained vigilant, yet the pair moved with careful precision, exploiting the land, the shadows, and the slightest distractions. Every heartbeat, every breath, carried weight, and the tension of the day seemed to crystallize into a single, pressing moment. By evening, they reached a secluded hollow at the edge of a small bluff, overlooking a stretch of plains that seemed to stretch endlessly. The Apache allowed a moment of rest, scanning the horizon with binoculars while the woman studied the land below. The watchers had not followed them directly, but their presence lingered, a constant reminder that the conflict was far from over. The woman realized that survival was not simply about avoiding immediate threats. It was about understanding the landscape, the forces at play, and the hidden challenges that could emerge at any moment. As darkness fell, the first stars appeared, faint against the deepening sky. The fire they built was small, controlled, careful, casting light only where necessary. The woman watched the Apache move, noting how he checked the perimeter, prepared weapons, and listened to the night. She understood now that his patience, skill, and calm authority were not just tools of survival, they were lessons in how to face the unknown, how to navigate danger with awareness and intelligence. And still, the main conflict remained unresolved. The watchers were near, unseen yet tangible, and the land itself pressed on them, testing every decision, every movement. The woman felt both fear and anticipation, understanding that the journey ahead would demand more than she had ever imagined. The Apache had led her into a world that required courage, observation, and trust, and she realized that this was only the beginning of the trials that awaited. The night deepened, carrying with it a silence that was thick and expectant. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint sounds that hinted at movement beyond the firelight. The Apache remained vigilant, eyes scanning the shadows, while the woman absorbed the lessons of the day, the rhythm of the land, and the subtleties of anticipation. The conflict that had begun in the town, with a simple exchange of $9.50, had expanded into a layered struggle, a test of survival, wit, courage, and the growing bond between two people navigating an unforgiving world. And as the fire flickered and the stars watched from above, the tension held. The watchers, the land, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead pressed close, a constant reminder that the story was far from over. Every instinct, every step, and every decision would matter in the hours and days to come, and neither the woman nor the Apache could afford complacency. The journey had only just begun, and the first moves of this complex conflict were already shaping the path that would test their courage, resilience, and trust in ways neither could yet predict. The night had grown cold, carrying a silence that pressed heavy against the earth. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the hollow where they had taken refuge. The woman huddled closer to it, trying to draw warmth and comfort, though her mind was restless, caught between fear and anticipation. The Apache moved quietly along the ridge of rocks, checking the perimeter, listening for the faintest hint of movement. Every sound, every shift in the wind, every rustle of leaves demanded attention. The tension had stretched so taut that even the faintest disturbance felt like a threat. From the dark beyond the firelight, subtle noises hinted that their watchers had not slept. The faint crunch of footsteps over dry leaves, the distant echo of a whisper, the rustle of an animal, but something more deliberate underlined it all. The Apache's hand never left his revolver. He crouched low, listening, interpreting every sound with the patience of a man who had spent years reading the land and its dangers. He did not speak. He could not risk giving away their position. The woman felt her pulse quicken, every nerve alert, but she tried to mirror his stillness, learning, observing, waiting. They had been moving for days, navigating hills, valleys, and the hidden paths carved by wind and water. Each step carried risk, and each pause was a negotiation with danger. The woman had grown stronger, more confident, yet she could feel the ever-present weight of the watchers closing in. She had begun to see the Apache not just as a protector, but as a guide into a world she had never known, one of sharp instincts, calculated risks, and the raw, unyielding reality of the wild. But she also realized that the ultimate test was approaching. Something in the land, in the air, was shifting toward an inevitable confrontation. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the Apache had led them to a rocky pass overlooking a narrow canyon. The terrain was perfect for ambush, and he paused to study it, noting every angle where danger could emerge. The woman crouched beside him, sensing the tension building. The watchers were close now, their presence almost tangible, and every instinct screamed that the final challenge was near. The Apache's eyes scanned the canyon below, calculating, measuring distances, observing patterns. Every step they had taken, every careful pause, had led them to this moment. "They will come," he said quietly, voice calm but firm. "We must be ready." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of experience. The woman nodded, gripping the rock beneath her hands, feeling her own determination rise alongside the fear. She understood now that survival depended not only on strength but on wit, patience, and the courage to act when the moment demanded it. The morning stretched on, the canyon slowly revealing more details as light fell across the jagged rocks. Shadows shifted, and movement could be seen in the distance. The watchers were finally visible, cautious figures picking their way along the ridges, scanning for signs of the pair below. The Apache whispered instructions, guiding her to take cover, to move silently, to be ready to act without hesitation. Every muscle in her body tensed, and for the first time she felt the raw thrill of confrontation, danger sharpened into clarity, fear sharpened into focus. The subplots of the journey intertwined with this looming climax. The woman's growth, the lessons of the land, and the unspoken trust between them all contributed to the tension, creating a complex web of stakes. Every glance, every movement, and every pause carried meaning. The watchers were skilled, patient, and persistent. They would test every decision the Apache and the woman made, probing for weakness, waiting for the smallest misstep to exploit. The woman realized that the danger was not just physical. It was psychological, a pressure that demanded every ounce of focus she had learned to summon. As they moved along the canyon edge, a sudden sound, a low whistle, deliberate and sharp, cut through the morning air. The Apache froze, signaling her to duck low behind a jagged boulder. The figures on the ridge reacted, subtle movements indicating awareness. The woman's heart raced, and she felt the air tighten around them as if the land itself were holding its breath. Every instinct screamed that the confrontation they had been preparing for was about to begin. The Apache whispered instructions, moving with quiet precision, positioning himself to shield her from view while maintaining a vantage point. He scanned the ridge, noting every potential angle of attack. The woman, crouched low, absorbed his actions, recognizing that the culmination of their journey demanded absolute attention. The watchers were more than just hunters. They were a force that tested patience, perception, and nerve. And the Apache had taught her that hesitation could be fatal. Hours passed as they navigated the ridge, shadows shifting with the sun, every movement deliberate, every breath controlled. The tension built steadily, a pressure that coiled tighter with every passing moment. The woman felt the weight of the journey, the lessons, and the choices pressing on her. She knew that when the confrontation came, it would not be simple. It would demand courage, cleverness, and the ability to act without hesitation. And yet, the anticipation carried a strange exhilaration, a sense that everything they had endured had been leading to this moment. By mid-afternoon, they reached a narrow ledge that overlooked the main path below. The watchers had been maneuvering carefully, trying to predict their movements, yet the Apache had anticipated their strategy. He whispered to her, guiding her to a concealed spot where they could observe without being seen. She crouched low, gripping the rock, heart pounding, as the figures below moved with methodical precision. Every instinct she had learned under the Apache's guidance told her to stay quiet, stay low, and stay alert. Suddenly, one of the watchers paused, scanning the canyon with sharp eyes. The woman froze, breath caught in her throat as the figure moved closer to where they had been a moment before. The Apache shifted slightly, a subtle gesture that guided her to adjust her position, keeping them hidden from view. The tension was unbearable. A taut line stretched across the landscape, ready to snap at the slightest misstep. Minutes felt like hours as the watchers continued their slow advance. The woman's mind raced, reviewing every lesson, every observation the Apache had shared. She realized that the confrontation was not only about survival, but about proving themselves against a relentless challenge. Every shadow, every rustle, every movement carried significance. They were approaching the culmination of their journey, and the climax, the point where all preparation and courage would be tested, was imminent. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the faint scent of smoke from a distant fire. The watchers flinched, reacting instinctively, and the Apache seized the moment, signaling the woman to move. They advanced with deliberate care, each step calculated to exploit the temporary distraction. The canyon seemed alive with anticipation, every stone and shadow conspiring in the tension that had built over days. The woman felt adrenaline surge, a mix of fear and focus that sharpened her senses and reinforced the lessons she had absorbed. They reached a narrow point where the canyon walls nearly closed, forcing the watchers into a predictable path. The Apache whispered instructions, guiding her to take advantage of cover, to use shadows, and to trust the timing. The figures below were unaware that their careful observation had been anticipated, and the land itself seemed to favor those who understood its rhythm. The woman's pulse raced, every nerve alert, knowing that the moment of confrontation was at hand. A sudden noise, a rock shifting, a branch snapping echoed through the canyon, and the watchers froze, their attention drawn upward. The Apache moved with lightning precision, positioning himself to shield the woman while maintaining a clear view. The tension reached its peak, the anticipation electric, every moment heavy with potential danger. The woman realized that all the fear, all the lessons, all the preparation had led to this critical point. Every decision now could tip the balance between success and disaster. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. The watchers, aware of some unseen presence, paused, scanning every angle. The Apache's eyes never wavered, muscles coiled, ready to act. The woman crouched beside him, senses sharp, heart pounding, absorbing every movement, every sound. The pressure was unbearable, yet exhilarating, a true test of all she had learned. The climax of their journey, the confrontation that would determine the path forward, loomed close. Suddenly, one of the watchers raised a hand, signaling to the others. Their movements became deliberate, coordinated, as if they had decided to advance simultaneously. The Apache whispered a single word, almost lost in the wind, and they shifted in unison, taking positions that maximized cover and advantage. The woman mirrored him, crouched low, muscles ready, every sense attuned to the land and the approaching threat. The air seemed to hold its breath, every creature in the canyon silent, waiting. Even the creek's soft murmur felt distant, insignificant compared to the weight of the moment. The watchers advanced, unaware that their every step had been anticipated, and the land itself seemed to hold its tension in the rocks and shadows. The woman's pulse hammered in her ears, a rhythm matching the slow, deliberate approach of those who would challenge them. The Apache whispered another instruction, and she nodded, understanding fully, trusting him completely. The culmination of days of preparation, of learning, of navigating fear was about to unfold. Every instinct, every lesson, every ounce of courage would be tested. The watchers were close, their eyes sharp, their movements precise. The woman realized that this moment was not only about survival, but about proving to herself that she was capable, that she could endure, and that the choices she had made could lead to triumph. Shadows stretched across the canyon, merging with the figures below, and the land seemed to hold its own tension in the quiet between breaths. The watchers moved closer, unaware that the pair above had already anticipated every possible path. The woman's hands were steady now, her mind sharp, and a strange sense of clarity replaced the fear that had gripped her for days. She understood that the next moments would define everything, that the confrontation was inevitable, and that the choices she and the Apache made in the coming minutes would shape the rest of their journey. The sun kissed the horizon, painting the canyon in gold and shadow. The watchers were nearly upon them, and the Apache signaled subtly. The woman tensed, muscles ready, eyes locked on the advancing figures. Every sound, every movement, every shadow carried weight. The climax, the most intense, suspenseful moment of the journey was here. The watchers did not yet know that their carefully planned approach was already outmaneuvered. The land, the lessons, the preparation all converged on this point. The Apache gave a final gesture, and the woman understood instantly. It was the signal that everything they had endured had led to. The tension, the anticipation, the fear, the lessons, the trust, they all built to this moment. The watchers drew closer, their rhythm deliberate, yet unaware of the counter that had been in place all along. The canyon held its breath. The wind carried a whisper of movement. And the two of them, hidden in shadow, waited for the moment when action, courage, and instinct would finally collide with the approaching threat. The first move was imminent. The canyon held its breath for only a moment longer. Then, with precision born of instinct and experience, the Apache made his move. A sudden shift in his stance sent a signal to the woman, and together they flowed into action like water spilling from a hidden spring. The watchers had not expected the suddenness, the calm control under pressure, and for a heartbeat, they froze, caught between hesitation and reaction. That pause was all the Apache needed. He moved first, leveraging the uneven ground and shadows to close in, striking with measured force. The watchers scrambled, but the Apache anticipated each step, each reaction, guiding the woman subtly through cover and positioning her where her presence could aid without exposing them. She moved instinctively now, muscles trained, senses sharp, heart steady despite the pounding adrenaline. Every lesson he had imparted, every tense day and night, coalesced into these precise movements. One by one, the watchers were disarmed or pushed back, caught off guard by the combination of skill, patience, and understanding of the land. The Apache never wasted effort. Each action was efficient, deliberate, and necessary. The woman, too, found herself acting with a confidence that had been growing quietly over the journey. She realized she could adapt, anticipate, and make decisions under pressure. Fear had not disappeared, but it had transformed into awareness, into a sharp edge of courage that drove her forward. The canyon echoed with the shifting movements and muffled sounds of struggle. Branches snapped, rocks scraped, and the distant call of a hawk seemed to underscore the intensity of the moment. The watchers had underestimated their opponents, thinking this would be an easy pursuit. Instead, they were facing a force honed by years of survival in the wild and strengthened by trust, loyalty, and purpose. The Apache and the woman worked in silent tandem, each move complementing the other, each breath calculated to maintain the upper hand. Then, as the sun sank lower, casting the canyon in a golden haze, the final watcher stumbled, caught between the rocks and the flowing coordination of the pair. The Apache moved quickly, but without unnecessary force. He disarmed, subdued, and secured, ensuring no one suffered more than necessary. The woman watched, heart still racing, yet a sense of relief began to seep in. The confrontation that had loomed over them for days, testing every instinct, every skill, had been overcome without cruelty, without recklessness, just patience, knowledge, and resolve. They paused to catch their breath, the canyon now quiet except for the gentle flow of the creek and the distant whisper of wind. The woman looked at the Apache, noticing the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the steady focus in his eyes, the quiet strength that had guided them through every danger. She realized how much she had changed, how much she had learned about the land, about courage, and about herself. The journey had been as much about self-discovery as it had been about survival. I never thought I could do this, she said finally, voice low, almost a whisper. Her eyes met his, filled with gratitude and a newfound confidence. But with you, I feel like I can face anything. The Apache nodded, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture, acknowledging both her words and the truth in them. There was no need for praise, no need for explanations. The bond forged in the crucible of danger spoke for itself. They moved cautiously along the canyon floor, checking their surroundings even as the tension eased slightly. The watchers were behind them, subdued, and the immediate threat had passed, but the landscape still demanded respect. Every rock, every shadow, every hidden angle held the potential for danger. The woman carried the lessons learned like a shield and a guide, moving with the Apache's quiet confidence, now partly her own. As they reached a wider part of the plain, the sense of relief grew stronger. Sunlight flooded the valley, illuminating rolling hills and distant water sources. Birds sang, unbothered by the shadows that had haunted the canyon. The woman inhaled deeply, savoring the fresh air, the openness, and the simple joy of having survived the tension that had pressed upon them for days. She realized that freedom was not just a physical state, but a state of mind, a trust in one's ability to face the unknown and overcome it. They found a secluded spot near a bend in the river to rest. The Apache allowed a moment of calm, showing her how to use the terrain for safety, how to maintain vigilance without becoming consumed by fear. She watched him work, learning yet another subtle lesson about balance, patience, and wisdom. They gathered water, prepared a small meal, and allowed themselves a few moments to simply exist, to breathe, and to take in the vast, untamed world around them. As night fell, the sky filled with stars, brilliant and countless, stretching across the horizon in quiet majesty. The woman sat near the fire, feeling the warmth on her skin and reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought about the $9.50, the small coin that had bought a chance, a beginning, and she smiled quietly at the irony. Value was not measured in money, but in opportunity, courage, and the choices one made when faced with the unknown. The Apache joined her, settling beside the fire, eyes scanning the horizon even as his body relaxed. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that needed no words. The journey had tested them, shaped them, and revealed their strengths. The canyon, the hills, the river, and the shadows had all been teachers, and they had learned. The lessons were embedded in their movements, in the silence they shared, and in the growing trust that connected them. Over the following days they traveled at a careful pace, staying alert but no longer under the acute pressure of immediate threat. The woman had learned to read the land, to anticipate danger, to move silently, and to act decisively. Her confidence grew with each step, and the Apache's quiet approval reinforced her sense of accomplishment. They encountered signs of other travelers, traces of wildlife, and the subtle markers of the land that guided them safely. Every obstacle overcame strengthened her resolve and deepened the connection between them. Along the way, the woman began to share more of her story, recounting the life she had left behind, the whispers and the judgments she had endured. The Apache listened without interruption, without judgment, offering only the occasional nod or word of understanding. In those moments, she realized that her past, though painful, had shaped her resilience, her insight, and her capacity for courage. And now, for the first time, she felt that those experiences had value, that they were part of the strength she carried forward. By the time they reached a safe crossing over the river, the tension that had defined the journey had eased, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and quiet hope. They paused to rest, the woman feeling a profound gratitude for the man who had guided her through danger, taught her to trust herself, and shown her the power of courage and observation. The journey had been grueling, yet every challenge had built something greater than survival. It had built confidence, skill, and a shared trust that could endure. They looked out over the valley, the sun dipping low, casting golden hues across the landscape. The Apache turned to the woman, voice calm and steady. "We made it this far," he said. "That is what matters. There will be more challenges, but you are ready. And together, we can face them." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words and the truth they carried. She realized that fear had been transformed into awareness and uncertainty had been tempered into understanding. That evening, as they set camp under a wide, open sky, the woman allowed herself to finally relax. The journey had tested every limit, yet they had endured, emerging stronger, wiser, and more confident. She looked at the Apache, recognizing not only a protector but a teacher, a guide, and a partner in the trials they had faced. The bond between them had grown quietly, built in the shadows, the wind, and the tension of the wild. The night was calm, the stars reflecting in the water nearby. The woman understood that freedom was more than escape. It was the ability to move forward with knowledge, courage, and trust. She had been judged for what she could not do, yet she had proven to herself what she could accomplish when guided, supported, and willing to learn. The coin that had begun this journey was trivial compared to the lessons, experiences, and self-discovery it had sparked. In the days that followed, the pair continued along the trails, navigating safely, learning, and growing. They encountered small towns and open plains, each moment reinforcing the woman's confidence and the Apache's respect for her growing skill. The watchers, the dangers, the tension all had shaped them, but now the future held possibility instead of fear. Each step forward was a reminder that courage and patience could overcome uncertainty, and that trust, once earned, was a powerful force. Finally, they reached a small settlement where the woman could rest fully, a place where she could begin anew. The Apache stayed close, ensuring her safety until she was settled, offering guidance on what to expect and how to navigate the new surroundings. She looked at him, a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and relief in her eyes. The journey had been harrowing, but it had transformed her completely. She was no longer a woman defined by limitations or judgment, but by her strength, courage, and the choices she had made when it mattered most. The Apache stood silently beside her, a quiet smile breaking the rugged line of his face. "Your journey is just beginning," he said. "But you know now that you are capable of facing whatever comes." She nodded, feeling a profound sense of completion, knowing that the trials they had endured had shaped her into someone resilient, aware, and strong. The tension of the past days had passed, replaced by hope, gratitude, and the knowledge that courage and trust could guide one through even the most uncertain paths. As the sun set, painting the sky in warm hues, the woman took a deep breath, feeling the freedom she had earned and the lessons that would stay with her always. The journey that began with $9.50 had led to something far greater: self-discovery, courage, and a partnership built in the crucible of challenge. She smiled quietly, knowing that the future, though uncertain, could now be faced with confidence. The Apache mounted his horse, nodding toward her. "Let's move on," he said, and together they rode forward, leaving behind the canyon, the shadows, and the trials, moving toward a horizon filled with possibility. The land stretched wide and welcoming before them, and for the first time, the woman felt the full measure of her freedom. She had survived, learned, and grown, and the journey had revealed something she had never known: that courage, trust, and determination could turn even the smallest coin into a life-changing opportunity. The sun disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving a soft glow in the sky. The river reflected the fading light, and the winds carried the quiet promise of peace. The Apache and the woman rode side by side, each aware of the journey behind them and the possibilities ahead. The threats, the tension, and the fear were behind them, replaced by the knowledge that they had endured together, learned together, and emerged stronger. The story of $9.50 had become a story of courage, trust, and transformation, and the woman knew she would never be defined by what she could not do again. The canyon, the hills, and the trails faded behind them as they rode into the wide-open plains. Every step, every lesson, every choice had led to this moment of triumph, quiet yet profound. And in that final stretch, the woman realized that the greatest victories were not measured in gold nor in conquest, but in the courage to face the unknown and the wisdom to navigate it with patience, skill, and heart. They rode on, leaving the past behind, carrying only the lessons and the strength they had gained. The journey was over, but the freedom it had earned was only just beginning, and the horizon ahead promised a life shaped by courage, trust, and possibility.